And we are live. Let's share the screen. We should be on right now. Yes, good things are happening. Okay, welcome everybody. It's another wonderful week, and we are getting into our three-step program. We're trying to learn Torah. We're going to talk about what's going on this week in the Parsha, what's going on this week in the calendar. We're looking at a practical, relevant life message to help us live Geuladik, redemption style. We want to make it our reality. We want to start this way even before we hit the sound of the big shofar, and we're certainly looking forward to hearing the sound of his arrival imminently. What's going on in the calendar this week? Big things. Big things are going on. This past weekend, more or less finishing today, was the Kinus HaShluchim, the gathering, the conference of Shluchim from around the world, which, just a second, I've lost that. The Kinus HaShluchim is a big deal. It's a big deal, obviously, because it's impressive. It's also a big deal because it helps and it makes a tremendous impact for the shluchim who join. But also, it's a big deal because the Rebbe asked that this take place. And many shluchim who come, they come even if they don't know how they're going to pay for it, because it's important for them, as it's important to do all the important things that they do, is to attend and to be part of the tremendous strengthening of one another. It's not easy to be a shliach. It's not easy to be on shlichus. And as one of the shluchim said publicly this year and every year, the realization of knowing that it's not a personal journey. The entire family is on the journey. And therefore, recharging is important not just for the shliach and his own, but also for the entire family. And of course, the shluchos, the women shluchim, go for their conference. But the idea is the same. It's there and it's designed to help us recharge and refocus. And in that sense, it's this time of the year that should bring koiches, refocused, re-energizing for all of us, wherever we may be. One big highlight, tremendous highlight. And we're just listening to some of the reports of the shluchim coming back, wherever they're going to their hometowns, to their shluchim, makam shlichus, and the fire that they're on is tremendously uplifting to hear that. But also, there's a big deal coming up this week on the calendar, which is also major. And that is, on this calendar week, we will have Thursday night, Friday will be Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh, the month of Kislev, the beginning of the new Yiddish month. And every Rosh Chodesh is extremely important. It's very special, especially for women, but also in general, in the Beis Hamikdash, they would bring extra karbanos. In Shul, we'll be davening extra Amida, almost like a Yom Tov, it's a Musaf. And in addition to that, there's no Tachnun set. As Hallel is sung, we sing praises to Hashem. It's a very special time, Rosh Chodesh. But this month particularly, the Rosh Chodesh of Kislev that we're going into, carries with it a very recent, a very uplifting Yom Tov, in the sense that the year is 1970. I'm going to say 8. Even though it might have been December 77. I don't know. Yeah, it was probably 1977, actually. The end of 77, because this time of the year. Rosh Chodesh Kislev, beginning of Tavshin Lamed Ches, was an enormous celebration, because from Simchas Torah, Shemini Atzeres Simchas Torah, which is already almost 2 months, well, it's just over a month, but yeah, it's a month and a half. The Rebbe had a very serious heart attack with another heart attack, followed that even worse, and had refused to go to the hospital, insisting that staying in 770 in his shul and turning his office into a hospital would be his best way to get better. And it's exactly what happened. The Rebbe's office became a hospital room, top state-of-the-art machinery, and doctors there all the time. And the noise that was coming from the shul downstairs was originally tried to quieten down, and the Rebbe insisted to let it be, because this was music of therapy, therapeutic music that helped the Rebbe feel stronger and stronger. And knowing that the Chassidim needed the Rebbe, and that the Rebbe's input was being taken so seriously in itself, literally helped the Rebbe get better. And the Rebbe didn't leave his office to go home until Rosh Chodesh Kislev, which is the day we will be marking this Thursday night, Friday. And to us, it's an important day that reminds us, obviously, that there's always hope and life at the end of a difficult stretch. And maybe even more than that, is a reminder that the Rebbe relies on us to be able to keep our connection to the Rebbe strong, that we can continue learning from every part of the journey. One particular story that highlights this very message is the story when the Rebbe at this time was in his hospital office room, where he's in 770 but being looked after as if he was in an ICU. And the Rebbe had to have blood taken. And as the doctor was cleaning the arm and inserting the syringe to take bloods, the Rebbe engaged the doctor in conversation and asked if he knows whether there is a force inside the syringe that's drawing out the blood, or it's just the lack of force, it's the vacuum that makes the blood come out. Now, obviously, the Rebbe knew the answer, and he knew that the doctor also knew the answer, which is why he asked the question. And the doctor kind of said it's, of course, the vacuum. It's the lack of matter inside the syringe that doesn't allow itself to remain empty, and therefore draws in whatever is available, including the blood, which is how the blood is drawn from the body into the syringe. And the Rebbe asked the doctor to give over to the Chassidim a lesson, a message from the vacuum, that the power of the vacuum is so intense, is so powerful. And what's the power of the vacuum? Power of the vacuum is the need that is created by a lack. And the power that is generated through a lack is so amazingly, so powerful. It can lift enormously heavy things that otherwise wouldn't be able to be lifted. And in this case, it's able to draw very important bloods from the person's body. But the power is generated. It's not an energy. It's the lack of the energy that calls out the need to be purposeful, that it makes good things happen. And that was exactly how the Rebbe viewed the entire illness or medical challenge that he had. It was an opportunity to grow. Every step of the way was part of the growth. And the Rebbe lived that. Obviously, it was not an easy time for the Rebbe personally. It wasn't an easy time for the Rebbe in his rework, if you could say such a thing, or his responsibility, Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe was so super razor focused on making sure that he's serving Hashem at every step of the way and teaching us how to do the same. That's one of the important things that we have this week. We remind ourselves from the Rosh Chodesh Kislev celebration that we're in a time that we have to stay focused. We can't afford to drop our guard or to allow ourselves to give in to whatever challenges we have. Instead, we must remind ourselves that whatever's going on is Hashem setting us up for the next tremendous win over and over again, and keeps us growing and keeps us going. So it's a big deal. It happens to be that on Shabbos we'll be marking Beis Kislev, which is an important date in the Dida Notzach story, where the Rebbe celebrated the court case that ended up actually going to the high court, the federal court in America, in which the Rebbe's library was established as a non-personal asset. It belongs to every single one of the Chassidim. And as the Rebbitzin Chaim Mushka said, the Rebbe and everything he has belongs to the Chassidim, because it's the non-Jewish federal judge appreciated that although there's monetary value in a lot of things, the value of money is incomparable to the value of what it means to have a Rebbe Chassid relationship. And this was in non-Jewish courts. And the message was that our connection to the Rebbe is much more than how much we can take, so to speak, out of it. Instead, is what it's going to inspire us, empower us to do. And in Beis Kislev was the day where the judge ordered, and eventually the Sfarim actually came back Sfarim that had been challenged as if they were just financial assets, to be brought back to Hasidim and the Rebbe's library back in 770, and therefore it's a big day on the Chabad calendar again in recent history. So all of this tells us three different things, each one of them very much part of our here and now, today, whether it's the Kinnos HaShluchim, which takes place this year, whether it's 1977, it's not so long ago, and even later, 1980s, when it was in the MEMS, when we had the story of the Svardim, and it's over and over the same idea. There are challenges. And those challenges are a calling for us to step up to our shlichus, to our responsibility, to our insistence that right now is a purposeful moment, not allowed to take place by Hashem, but orchestrated by Hashem Yisbarach. And therefore, it's important for us to realize that we have now an opportunity like never. It's true for every day. But in a week like this week, it's even more important for us to continue doing that. Okay, this is what's going on the calendar. What's going on in the Parsha? In the Parsha, we've done Bereshis Noach Lecha Chavayera Chayisara. We're up to number 6. Parshah's Toldos, which is this week's Parsha. We have a whole another level to the story that we're flying through the generations, starting from the beginning. Oh, we're getting noise. Yeah, no problem. Please unmute if you have anything to say at any time, no problem. But in Parshas Toldos, we've moved on from the storyline. We start off with Adam Arishon, first man and woman. We moved on from there to Noach, which that's just another Parsha. And then we had Avraham Avinu. And Avraham Avinu's highlight was from Parshas Lech Lecha Vayera and Chayesara. And in this week's Parsha, Parshas Toldos, we've now fully moved on to the next generation, and that is Yitzchak Avinu, Isaac, the son of Avraham and Sarah, who Hashem had told us in the end of last week's Parsha very explicitly. And Avraham tells that and acts that way, that out of all of Avraham's children, which he had 8 of, Ki b'Yitzchak yikarei l'chazara, his future will be Yitzchak. The descendant of Avraham will be named by Yitzchak, and therefore Avraham actually gives a lot of gifts to his other children and sends them on the way, and Yitzchak becomes his future. And in this week's Parsha, we read about Yitzchak's future. Last week we read how Avraham found Yitzchak a wife, Rebecca, and Rivka and Yitzchak in this week's Parsha have been married for 20 years, and they still don't have any children. Now you've got to remember, Hashem had promised Avraham that his children will be as many as the stars of the sky. And Hashem had promised Avraham before he left, Lech Lecha, that if he travels to Canaan, to Eretz Yisrael, then he will make him famous, he will make him wealthy, and he'll make him, his children, his future, to be enormous. Avraham had traveled all the way up to Canaan only to find that there was a famine, he couldn't stay there and had to leave. He finally came back, and he waited and waited to have children. He didn't have children, he took Hagar and all back and forwards, and eventually Sarah has a child at the age of 190. He was 100 and she was 90. But this same Yitzchak, the child who was born, was almost put to death in the Akedah. And now he finally marries him off, and he finds him a wife at the age of almost 40. And now Yitzchak waits a further 20 years, and there's no children yet. And Yitzchak and Rivka must have been thinking, at least part of their thought process, where is the promise of Hashem? Years and years are going by, no children. Where's the future going to come from? And they daven to Hashem. They daven Noichach Ishtoi, and eventually, miracle of miracles, Rivka gets pregnant, but the pregnancy is so difficult, literally because it was a difficult pregnancy, midrashically also because she had very mixed feelings. She felt the unborn fetus urges to go out and to be born and to kick very hard, almost as if it was drawn towards two very different settings. On the one hand, it was drawn towards Yeshiva, Shem Ve'ever, the places of holiness at that time. And at the same time, she felt she was being drawn towards the places of evil and badness, also from the same way. And what bothered her was, what's going on? How can they both be correct? What sort of message or mess is this going to allude to? And eventually she goes to ask the prophet at the time, to Shem. She's told in the name of Hashem, you're carrying twins, and the two unborn children are going to be so different from each other. They're going to be enormously different, and that's why you feel two opposite urges, because it's exactly what it's going to look like. Now, this is almost like a peek into the future. A peek into the future doesn't limit the free choice. Each child can choose what to do with their energy. But it did give her a taste of what she might be looking forward to. And as the first child is born, her firstborn, her Bechor, Esav comes out. And Yaakov was right behind, whatever that means, literally. The Pasuk seems to say, Yaakov was almost holding on to the heel of the firstborn, but the firstborn is Esav. Esav comes out almost complete, as we'll learn, much more hair, whereas Yaakov is much more plain, placid. Esav is ruddy and red. Yaakov is more regular. And as time continues, those early indications seem to be playing out exactly that way. Yaakov doesn't take long. He's very, very active, but not active necessarily in the way his parents would have hoped for. He becomes a hunter, a man of the field, and eventually he's not just hunting game, not just hunting animals. He wasn't a very menschliche mensch. He was hunting people, and he didn't have very good habits in general. Whereas Yaakov, the younger of the brothers, was Ish Tam Yoshev V'Haner, was a complete and a plain, a sincere man who sat and studied in the tents. He was there, he was an indoor kind of fellow. You might call him the introvert and the extrovert. But the story takes a new twist. When Avraham Avinu passes away and Father Yitzchak is mourning the loss of his father, and Yaakov, who's at home, is preparing the lentil soup for his father's mourning, for the Shiva, so to speak, the Beis HaEvos. And just then Esav walks in after having killed Nimrod and stealing from Nimrod the extremely precious coat that Nimrod had also stolen and had received from Adam HaRishon, the very first man who had a coat from Hashem. This was in the hands of Nimrod, and now Esav had laid his hands upon it. But at that time, Esav is very, very tired, worn out from a day of very, very difficult killing and hunting, and he asks Yaakov to give him that soup. And Yaakov's standing there and he's watching this brother of his, a murderer, who's just uninterested in anything meaningful, completely self-absorbed, not a nice kind of fellow. And he's thinking to himself, the firstborn is the servant of Hashem. Originally, before the sin of the golden calf, the Bechor was always the designated service person to work on behalf of Hashem. And that's how it was supposed to be in the Beis HaMikdash. The Bechor was going to be the Kohen. And Yaakov's thinking, Gewalt, what sort of person is going to serve Hashem? He thinks to himself, the best option is to ask Esav if he would be willing to sell his birthright, in which he does. And Esav's response leans straight into that. He says, me, serving the Beis HaMikdash, worship Hashem, bring korbanos, I don't need that. You only live once. I'm having a good time. And therefore, he sells his birthright in exchange for that lentil soup right there. And that was a very stark indicator about where Esav was headed and where Yaakov was headed. The story continues that Yitzchak has to leave town from where he was living because the area came under famine, similar to the story of his father Yitzchak, Avram. He moves down to Gerar to Plishtim. He doesn't leave Israel because he can't leave, as we already learned when he went to get a wife. But he goes down to Plishtim area, and there he does the same thing his father had done with his mother, he does with his wife. He tells the local authorities that his wife is really his sister. He was worried in case they would do the same thing his father was worried about. They might try and arrange an accident to have him dead and then take his wife. And it's there that Yitzchak settles. He redigs up the wells that his father had dug up, only not before the whole incident where Rivka was taken by, oh, he wasn't destroyed, she wasn't taken, was almost taken by Abimelech, but it was at that place where Yitzchak Avinu digs new wells and he starts prospering, making a barren, famine-struck land grow. And every time he plants, he is so successful. People are doing anything to be a part of Yitzchak's enormous, wealthy success. And it's at that time that things are very peaceful for Yitzchak. Things are smooth sailing. Esav and Yaakov are growing, the twins, and Esav already takes two Hittite women in official marriage, besides for everything else he was doing. And eventually Yitzchak calls in his son Esav, his oldest son, and says to him that he's getting older. His sight is already no longer with him. He can't see well. He wants to bless his oldest son with brachas, just in case he passes away. At least he'll have a chance to bless his son. So he says to him famously, bring me food so that I'll be in a good mood. And when I'm joyous, that's when the best blessings come through. Because in order to give a bracha, a person has to be in an uplifted, joyful mood. We find the same halacha required when the koyanim give brachas, birchas koyanim in shul. They only do birchas koyanim in a time of a good mood, when they're in a time of joy. Which is why outside of Eretz Yisrael, we wait for Yom Tov, which is a joyous time. Inside of Eretz Yisrael, they'll give birchas koyanim much more often than that, whether it's every Shabbos, whether it's every day. But in order to give a bracha, one has to be in an uplifted, joyful mood. So Esav goes out to hunt. And as he leaves, their mother, Rivka, who overheard the conversation, knows that Yitzchak has in mind. Yitzchak has in mind to bless their older son, who is so off the beaten track, so unworthy of such a bracha, compared to their younger son, who has done everything right, and she arranges and orchestrates that Yaakov should get that bracha. Not before Yaakov says, but what's going to happen? He's worried, he doesn't want to deceive, he doesn't want to say anything that's not truthful. And Rivka says, you must. It's on me. It's so important that the brachas of Father Yitzchak get passed on to the right hands and not to Esau. She dresses him up, she gets him to bring in 2 goats, and she cooks the most delicious food that Yitzchak would like, and sends in Yaakov into the room and says, go in there and play the role, make as if you're Esav, get the blessings, because that's what's important. And he does. And as he walks in, he's wearing that fantastical cloak that Esav has stolen off Nimrod. And as he walks in, it made him feel hairy. It made him feel like Esav would feel. But as he opens his mouth to speak, something doesn't sound like Esav. He sounds like a mensch. He sounds like a nice person. He sounds like somebody who Hashem is a big part of his equation. And Yitzchak famously says, Hakol kol Yaakov. The voice sounds like Yaakov, v'hayadayim midei Esav, but the hands are the hands of Esav. He told him to come close, and he touched him, and he says, oh, it feels like Esav, but you sound like Yaakov. Obviously, we learn from that also that when we talk and we use the power of being able to communicate, that's a Yaakov sort of communication. Whereas if we revert to using brute force, fighting, warring, that's an Esav type of response. We find later on, when it came to the story of Bilam, he tried to destroy the Yidden, God forbid, using the power of voice, power of talking. And the response was, Hashem says, if he's using speech, you must go to war to attack him with the power of hands that Yitzchak had blessed Esau with. The story goes that as Yaakov finishes giving the most gorgeous v'yitin l'cha brachas to Yaakov, and Yaakov's about to leave, Esau walks in and Yaakov sneaks out just in the nick of time and slips out. And here's Esau with his food that he had prepared for his father, and he says to his father, give me a bracha, I've brought you the food. And Yaakov is already out the room. Yitzchak hears that another son has come and he's brought food, and he realizes what had happened. And he says, oh, your brother has already come and he's received the blessings. Gam Baruch Yeh, and the blessings are indeed his. And Esau lets out a terrible cry. He says to his father, you know his name is Yaakov? That name matches him. Yaakov means heel, but also can mean trick. He's tricked me twice. And the father asks Esau, what's the 2 times he's tricked you? He says he's tricked me, he made me sell the rights to the firstborn, and now he's tricked me, he's taken my blessings. And of course, Yitzchak hears this and he feels better, because now he realizes that the rights to the firstborn have actually been sold on to Yaakov, and Yaakov was right to get the brachas. Yaakov gives Esau a very interesting after bracha. He says, I can't bless you the full brachas because I've already made you subservient to Yaakov. However, whenever Yaakov misbehaves, then you will have the right to rise and the brachas will be yours. Unfortunately, throughout history, as the Gemara tells us, whenever Yerushalayim was powerful, when the Jewish capital was powerful, then Rome was not. And when Yerushalayim fell, that's when Rome rose. And of course, we know that the end of the story will be that once again, Yisraelim will rise and Yaakov will refine Esau. Hashem will be the ruler of the entire world, including of Esau. The end of the story of this week's Parshah is that although Esau gets some form of brachas, he is burning mad. He is so angry. Gangster as he may be, indifferent and uncaring, he knew at the end of the day, brachas from his father, Yitzchak's brachas, are worth fighting over. They're worth getting. And the fact that he was outsmarted was hard enough, but outsmarted with these brachas from his father, he knew this was a big deal. And in his mind, he swore he's going to wait for the right time. And he's going to take out Yaakov. He's not going to let Yaakov survive. Chas v'shalom. And Mother Rivka realized, and she therefore told Yaakov, I can't have you stay here. She went to Father Yitzchak and said to him, whatever happens, we can't let Yaakov marry locally. Ugh, it's hard enough for me that I've seen Esau marry locally. We must send Yaakov far away to my hometown, where I came from, and let him find a wife from back home from the family, because the local girls are no good for him. And that's exactly what Yitzchak tells Yaakov to do. You must travel to where your mother was from, and from where his grandfather Avram was from, and there you'll find a wife. In the meantime, Esau overhears and realizes that father was talking about not having local girls as a wife, so he takes an additional wife, a daughter of Yishmael, who was with part of the family, their cousin, and that's who he gets married to, and Machla, the daughter of Yishmael, and that's how the parasha ends. So this is the parasha where we've moved on from Avraham Avinu. We're now in the section that talks with about Yitzchak. It's one parasha that focuses mainly on Yitzchak and his children, and from next parasha on, we're going to be talking about Yaakov and going from there to the Shvatim. And it moves very fast now. We're going from step to step until we get more or less to the story of each of the Shvatim as we'll go through it. But as you can imagine, Yitzchak Avinu, Yitzchak, our forefather, has an enormous amount of edge, of addition, of extra, of newness, an advantage that Avraham Avinu didn't have. Their lives looked very different. Their style was very different. And although Avraham was the innovator, the debater, the agitator, the one who didn't sleep, didn't stay with the status quo, he did whatever he could to push the bar and keep things growing. He was an initiator in the sense that he created new circles of influence. And he made sure over and over again that those who didn't recognize Hashem should. And he changed the landscape in an enormous way. He's a revolutionist. Yitzchak was very different. Yitzchak was extremely stable. And Yitzchak's path was one of very, very calculated and settled sort of path. That was Yitzchak. Where does Yaakov fall into the picture? Yaakov is going to take both Abraham's energy of innovator and Yitzchak's energy of calculated stability and synthesize a balance of both. That is the general understanding of where this parsha lays. We have the influence of Ram moved into Yitzchak, and we're discovering the energy of Yaakov. We'll learn more about it as we go through Yaakov's life, but in this week's Sedra, we're going to notice, very interestingly, how Yitzchak's brachas end up in Yaakov's path. I don't mean the path as he walked that path, in that as well, but also into the new path that Yaakov was showing us, was leading, was laying out for us. That path receives the continuation of Yitzchak's brachas, and that's to us a very important message. The way the wording of this question of the class is the following. It's quite wordy. Can you truly be yourself while following a path set by others? So if somebody else decides for us, can it be me? Can I shine in someone else's path? Or in other words, Yiddishkeit, Jewish life, where do individuality and tradition meet or clash in your own Jewish life? The question is, do you find a way to express your own personality, your own self within Yiddishkeit, or is that asking for a clash where you have to pick and choose one or the other? Any thoughts about the matter? You don't have to answer the question. You could just throw a thought. What comes to mind when you think about this?
Well, if you're following Torah and you're following Yiddishkeit, you shouldn't have too much of a problem following things because you have got something to follow.
What about individuality?
Pardon me?
Individuality.
You
Out
can,
the window?
everybody is an individual because everybody is different. Hashem didn't make us all the same. That's what makes it so interesting.
Correct.
So,
Is that what Yiddishkeit wants?
If you're following something and you're following it to the word and the letter, you will be an individual, but you will also be doing something to make yourself part of a community.
I like it. Okay.
So that's important.
Absolutely.
You should never ever stop being an individual, because once you stop being that, you stop being the person that you are.
Yeah.
And Hashem made us a mind. He gave us a mind and things to do, and it's for us to decide, obviously, to do the right thing, but we're all individuals.
100%. 100% well said. Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, the Rebbe, what I've been reading on Chabad.org, Sylvia promoting them, the Rebbe, what I recall from a musician and an artist, and he told them, to keep it within the Torah, but still have their desires for music or art and things like that. And so they kept their individuality and met tradition.
Yes, indeed. We're actually going to get back to that, though. I'm going to borrow the artist and what was the other one? The musician. Yes, we'll go back to that as well. It's going to be a big part of what the Sikha is talking about. Go on, Claire, tell us something. What comes to mind? There we go.
Right. So I was thinking, well, yes, Hashem has set our path, but He's also allowed us to have choice. So yes, we should be truly, if we're following Torah, we should be authentic, shouldn't we? And hopefully follow the path. I don't know, that doesn't really make sense.
It does make a lot of sense to me. I'm going to say what I'm hearing. You'll tell me if I'm getting this right.
Yeah.
Sometimes people translate free choice to choose whether I will follow or not follow. And what we're all saying here, all three of us have said, actually, we have choice to follow or not follow. But even when we are following, we have the choice to bring out our individuality as we follow.
Yeah.
And we're going to
Yeah.
focus specifically on that because the choice to follow or not to follow doesn't need much of our share. It doesn't need a lesson from Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. We know that the right thing to do is to follow. We know it's a challenge and therefore it's not easy to follow. But the free choice is ours and we can choose to do the right thing. It doesn't make it simple, but that's really what we need to be doing, choosing to do the right thing. We want to take this one step further. When we choose to do the right thing, we want to choose to do it in such a way it doesn't clash with our individuality. Instead, it's best done in our individual way when and wherever possible. And we're going to try and figure out where we can find ways to express that individuality without doing the wrong thing. So let's get in and we'll talk about how it's in the parasha. It is a bit of a few steps in the actual sikha, but hopefully we'll get through it and we'll get to the end with the message loud and clear. The message is going to be like Yaakov, which is why the brachas ended up in Yaakov's path. Okay, from a young age, Yaakov takes a studious path and Esav chooses a wild and wayward one. Let's see that in the silent verses just very quickly. The lads grew up. Esav became a man who understood hunting, a man of the field. Yaakov was a wholesome man living in tents. Isaac loved Esav because he ate of his trappings, but Rivka loved Yaakov. Okay, so that last pasuk tells us that although there was the good kid and the wild kid, he called him here wayward. I didn't say that. Understood hunting, a man of the field. In the previous slide, he said it. But over here we're saying that Esau had special favor in the eyes of his father. Why? Ki tzayid befiv. Because Esau had a way of feeding Yitzchak his trappings, whatever that means, compared to Rivka, who, first of all, she could see what was going on. She had no problem with her sight, but also her intuition saw what was going on, not just in front of her, but what was happening around, and she understood what was what, and she loved Yaakov for being able to hold on to the straight and narrow, compared to Esau, who didn't. What we're going to focus on is, why would Yitzchak find favor? Why would Yitzchak favor Esau, the wild hunter, over the pious and studious Yaakov? We can understand why Rivka felt close to her son Yaakov, but what did Yitzchak see in Esau? So Rashi right away tells us the basic pshat. What does it mean? He ate from his trappings, Yedei Tzayid. So first he says, what does it mean that Esau was a hunter? In which way? Who understood hunting? Esau knew how to trap and deceive his father with his mouth. And Rashi quotes the Medrash that says that Esau would come and ask his father deep questions, such as, he'd ask him, Father, how do we give maaser from salt and from straw? His father thereby thought that he was scrupulous in his mitzvah observance. Now, maaser means me'eser, tithe. Tithing, how does one tithe salt and straw? So, when father hears his son coming to ask him a shaila, how do you do tithing for salt and straw? Esau asks seemingly pious questions to present himself as religiously sincere. And this influenced Yitzchak's desire to bless him before his death. This is my son who always comes to ask me such great halachic questions. He must be so pious. He deserves the brachas. That is the simple understanding of Rashi. Now, we're not finished yet. The background of this is that Yitzchak was old. When Yitzchak grew old, his eyesight faded, he couldn't see. He called Esav, his eldest son, and said to him, my son, Esav said to him, here I am. As it said, behold, if you please, I'm old and then my death. Now therefore, please take your equipment, your sword and your bow, and go out to the field and trap deer for me. Make it to a tasty dish for me, the way I like it, and bring it to me that I may eat, so that my soul will bless you before I die. And as we said beforehand, with the help of his mother, Yaakov ended up tricking his father into giving him the brachas. Okay, here's the question. This is actually from the Yativ Yisroch Moshe. This Moshe writes, there is much to examine in these verses. How was Esav so convincingly wise as to deceive his connivingly wise as to deceive his saintly father? If he was someone who openly set intents and engaged in hunting secretly, there would be more room for error. But considering that he was a man of the field, and everyone knew that, exposed to all, with what schemes and cunning did he deceive his father? Also, the Medrash, which says that he would trap and deceive him with his words, is likewise puzzling. How exactly did he mislead his father by asking one or two questions he didn't know what his son was up to? And in the words of the Shem Mishmol, we must understand from the story, it seems that Yitzchak didn't want to bless Yaakov at all. Why? Was he unaware that Yaakov was a wholesome man living in his tents? He had no clue what Yaakov was up to? He was willing to bless Esav for one or two questions, and Yaakov never asked him any questions? What's going on? Even if he thought Esav was righteous because he deceived his father with his mouth, we still don't find that he thought opposite of Yaakov. So what's going on? Even if we can explain how Esav got the better of his father, it doesn't explain why Yitzchak didn't want to bless his more righteous son. So the questions we have so far is, how could Yitzchak, a spiritual giant, be so easily fooled by Esav? Just want to share a quick story. There was once a young yeshiva boy who had heard about the Rebbe's ability to read everything about a person on their forehead. As you walk by the Rebbe took one look and knew what you were up to. And he had heard that the Rebbe sees in a person's forehead everything that goes on. So he came in by the Rebbe for dollars, wearing his hat down to here, covering his forehead. And as he walks by the Rebbe, I think the story goes that the Rebbe said something like, I can see on your nose, or something like that. But if a person's a righteous individual, they can see what's going on. The aura, the presentation of a person should be clear to somebody like Yitzchak. How could he have been fooled by Esav? Question number one. And more importantly, why did Esav ask Yitzchak these particular questions? What about these questions make it trickery? What was Esav trying to accomplish with the satiric questions about salt and straw? What's of those two questions? And of course, the other part we've been asking is, what about Yaakov? Why didn't Esau just bless both sons? Why did he only have one bracha? He was only going to give to Esau. And then in turn, when it came to Yaakov, he didn't give it to Esau. He had to make up some other smaller bracha. So the way we're going to address this, we're going to start off with the middle observation, the salt and the straw. Because actually, the salt and the straw makes our question even more difficult to understand. It's going to be harder for us to think that Yitzchak was really fooled by Esav, because the law is, the halacha is, salt and straw are two items that actually you're not supposed to take meiser. You don't tithe. You only tithe things that grow, that are food. And salt in itself isn't a food. And straw in itself, although it comes with wheat, the wheat you take meiser from, the straw which is left over used for animal fodder, you don't take meiser from. So really, when Esav comes to ask father, how do you take meiser from salt and straw? He's showing himself up as an ignoramus, as somebody who has no clue what's going on. And if anything, he doesn't sound like a righteous person. He sounds like somebody who doesn't know which way to hold the book. Nothing wrong with that, but just not righteous necessarily. It's not certainly an indicator that somebody's exceptional. And this is going to be part of the question. The answer is going to be, he chose straw and salt of all items because they are exempt from meiser, both biblically and rabbinically. This stands in contrast to other items like vegetables, which though exempt biblically from meiser, are nevertheless obligated rabbinically. And the biblical exemption is derived from the verse attentively grain, excluding vegetables that aren't grain, and actually says the Mizrahi, because there's no obligation to tithe salt or straw, that's exactly why he chose the salt and the straw to come and ask his father. He says, Father, Nobody else does salt and straw, but I'd like to do that as well. Is that even a thing though? What kind of question is the asked Hazel on the tithe? It's different how on this. The way the masculine David brings us to the answer is going to be by the word maaser. What does maaser even mean? A tenth. When you want to tithe something, it should be quite obvious how to tithe it. Count it, split it into 10, and give away one piece. Why is there even a question, how does one tithe salt? And why is there even a question, how does one tithe straw? How do you tithe? Is it a question in mathematics? If the question was, does one give maaser? That's a fair question. But how shouldn't really be even a question. Clearly, there's something going on more than just a question of how to count. And the answer is going to be to understand that although nowadays we don't give tithings for anything that isn't a food, in the times before the Torah, they actually did. And there's a passage that backs it up in the next slide when Avraham Avinu comes back from the war, saving his nephew Lot. He gives tithes to Melchizedek in appreciation and thanksgiving to Hashem. And there the verse clearly said he gives tithes from everything. And it seems that salt and straw would also be items that people would give tithes from before the giving of the Torah. However, this helps us appreciate that Esau was actually coming with a layered, deep question. That with the context of understanding that people gave Maaseh from everything, he wasn't asking what is 10 divided by 10. He wasn't asking what's 100 divided by 10. He was asking, how do we calculate the value of any given item in the world? Because what's unique about salt and straw, the common factor between salt and straw is that both of them on their own have very little value. But when put into practice, put to good use, their value is so much noticeable. It's enormous. Take salt, for example. If you've ever had a food that was cooked, a stew made without any salt, you can tell immediately there's no salt in the food. But how much salt needs to go in compared to the ratio of, let's say, meat to salt? Minimal. But that minimal amount changes the entire stew. And the straw is the same thing. If you take straw and you want to feed it as fodder to the animals, it's very cheap, which is why they use it to feed animals. If you want to use it to be a fire starter, it's very cheap and therefore doesn't have much value. But if you're making bricks and you miss out the straw that would hold it together, it's like you miss out the flour in making a cake. Straw is so important when it's put to its use. But when it's on its own, it has very little value. And this is what Esau is asking. If you have somebody who on their own right now, as they stand, has very little value, but its potential, when it's put to its correct use, is enormous. How do I measure? Do I measure by what it is right now, and therefore just count up how much salt you have, give a tenth of that salt? Or does it have to have an entirely different calculation because it has in it the potential for enormous effect? Let's read this inside. The common factor between salt and straw, despite their differences, is that on their own, they have no significant value. But when mixed with other things, they bring a benefit far beyond what they offer individually. This can be plainly observed. A small amount of salt, which on its own has minimal monetary value or importance, adds flavor to a dish or food in a way that greatly enhances it far beyond the actual quantity of salt itself. Not only does it add taste, but without it, the food may be lacking altogether. The same applies to straw. In and of itself, whether as animal fodder or as fuel for an oven, etc., it has very little monetary value or significance. But when it's used to make bricks for construction, its value is greatly increased. This was Esav's question in this unique case. In his case, there is room to say that the salt and straw tithe should not be measured by standard unit, weight, or count like tithing animals, but rather by the value those items will have when actually used. If that's so, then the question regarding salt and straw becomes, how does one calculate their worth? According to the current standalone value, or according to the benefit they will produce when used in combination as flavoring as a mixture for their correct usage. So now whether Esav's question was he actually wanted to know the answer, we know he didn't. And Yitzhak wasn't so concerned about whether he wanted to know the answer, because the question itself was an indicator of where Esav's mind was taking him, whether it was consciously or subconsciously. There was something in the wording of Esav's pretext or cover story, cover questions that were trying to impress Father Yitzchak that caught Yitzchak's eye and helped him realize that he knew what Esav was up to on that particular day, in that stage of his life. But Esav's question was whether Meiser should be measured by an item's low intrinsic value as it stands, or its great impact when used. It was nuanced, a halachic question, and it was enough to convince Yitzchak of Esav's potential sincerity and depth. And the potential in Esav's sincerity and depth caught Yitzchak's eye. Now, in order to get the next step of this equation to appreciate what Yitzchak saw in the potential of Esav that was so convincing, it wasn't because he thought that Yitzchak was such a role model that he wished to bless him. He knew what Esav was up to. But he thought of the question that Yitzchak had asked, measuring salt, not by what it is right now, but by its potential, made him think about Esav, not like he is right now, but what Esav's purpose and he's designed to do. So we're going to take a little detour to describe, at least to touch upon, what the power of Esav was compared to the power of Yaakov, which would explain why Yitzchak was about to invest his everything into Esav to try and actualize that potential that Esav corresponded to. Let's see it inside. Stories in Torah of manifestation of profound spiritual dynamics. So if you have a Esav and you have a Yaakov, they were indeed two human beings, and they're true stories, but they are a manifestation, an expression of an enormous idea that Hashem feels that we should know about and writes it into the Torah in story format of a true story that played itself out, but it played itself out as a manifestation, an expression of something much larger taking place in all of the cosmic levels. Here is a quote from the Alter Rebbe. According to Kabbalah, says the Alter Rebbe, Yaakov is rooted in the spiritual world of tikkun, of discipline, whereas Esav was rooted in the spiritual world of toyu, of chaos. Which one's better, discipline or chaos? Well, discipline is much more workable, but in chaos, there is tremendous energy, and unless it's organized, it remains chaotic. But if we manage to harness the chaos, the energy there is tremendously greater. The lights of Toyu are very powerful, but they could not be contained. As a result, the lights withdrew, leaving the containers to shatter and fall below. Shviras HaKelim, which is an enormous topic and subject in Lorian Kabbalah and the Arizal's Kabbalah, but we're going to leave it at that and just say that the chaos on its own is not workable. This is why Esav, as he manifested in this world, became a wicked person, because it wasn't able to express the tremendous potential in a harnessed way, in a workable way, and therefore it looks wild, wayward, and wicked. However, when considering the ultimate root of Esav in the bright lights of Toyu, these lights are actually loftier than the light of Tikkun, and that's where his potential shone. Esav's soul came from the chaotic realm of Toyu, intensely divine light without the vessels to contain it, and because he had such intense potential, Yitzchak thinks of salt and straw that his son talks about, and he says, Esav, this is the power I need to harness somehow. Asa's question about salt and straw wasn't just halachic, it was existential. He was asking, should I be seen for what I am now or for what I could become? He was pleading to be judged by his potential, not his present state. We must also hear that call from so many children who are being asked, do not judge me by what it looks like on the here and now. Notice the potential and talk to me to that side of me and help me get there. And Yitzchak cannot say no. He needs to. And he's telling us to do the same. But it takes a Yiddish mama to qualify it. Let's just read a few more slides. This is the deeper meaning of the words Yitzchak loved Esav. For in Esav's supernal souls there were sparks of holiness that had been trapped and named the souls of Shmai and Naftalion, the souls of Rabbi Meir, the souls of other sparks of holiness. All these converts who were born not Jewish and were descendants of Esav were tremendous potential, desperately calling to be unleashed. And Yitzchak saw them generations earlier. Many of them destined not to be revealed until the days of Mashiach. But all the Mashiach married in the Shpitis are Esav. It will be then at the time that Esav will come to full glory. And Yitzchak saw Esav as someone with untapped, explosive potential who needed encouragement to realize it. And these blessings were meant to awaken that greatness. Yaakov, already on a strong spiritual path, didn't need that extra push. And the design of the brachas weren't just to make sure you have a comfortable life. The design of the brachas were to make sure that the purpose of our very being would be called out to the open, and that journey should be a blessed journey, a comfortable journey, a journey that would make us feel uplifted and joyful. And that was the bracha that Yitzchak was about to give. That wasn't a bracha that Yaakov needed. That was a bracha all about harnessing, unleashing, realizing, bringing into reality the tremendous explosive potential of Esav. And that's what Yitzchak had in mind. He calls Esav, he says, Esav, we're going to do something enormous right now. I'm going to give every bit of bracha that I have, invest it into your potential. And that was in itself a very good idea. However, Esav's potential remained unfulfilled due to a lack of self-mastery. Esav actually would never been able to carry out that journey on his own. Because Esav on his own, even with the biggest and strongest brachas, would not have been able to overcome the challenge and push forward to bring that into the open. It needed to have Yaakov's balance, navigating to constantly being innovation and yet stick to the tradition, self-expression, individuality, and at the same time within the framework of absolute Torah. We're running out against the time, but the mashal that someone mentioned earlier, I can't remember who mentioned the painter. If you tell a painter, you can paint whatever you want with whatever you want, there are no boundaries, there are no limits, and no framework, you will usually get either mental block where they can no longer think, they don't know what to start with, or you'll get such abstract art, they'll call it modern art because there's nothing to it. But if you give a painter some sort of framework, you need to paint a particular sort of setting. You need to have a certain selection of colors, of pigments, of something. That itself, that sort of structure will allow them to express themselves much more. And when the Torah tells us this is the framework, now find your expression. This is the framework. Now find your expression. This is what Yaakov helps Esav realize. You have tremendous potential. It's limitless. But unless there's a framework, it'll get you nowhere. And therefore the brachas had to be given to Yaakov, the equalizer between innovation of Avraham Avinu and stability of Yitzchak. To be able to balance that is the calling of us, the children of Yaakov B'nai Yisrael. And it's with that approach that we have to never overlook the real potential that can be found in the energy like Esav. Keep it within the framework, but never suffocate its individuality and its expression. Just keep it within the framework and it will drive, it will flow, it will grow, it will bring us to potentials that we've never had before. In our personal life, we might not always have it as such clear and polar opposite realities, but we do have constantly that balance between doing what we would do, however we would do it, compared to making sure that whatever we wanted to do is expressing the purpose for which we were created. And when we do that, not only are we not stifling ourselves, that brings out the best within us, and it makes us feel the best purposeful people, because that's what purpose really looks like. This week's Parsha teaches us Yaakov and Esav are in a partnership to bring out the brachas of Hashem, and Yitzchak's investment with the qualification of Mother Rivka makes sure that we are best positioned to make that happen then, to make that happen now, and Be'ez Hashem very soon, Va'olam Mashiach Mahartzin L'Shpet Ezer Esav will witness Yitzchak celebrating Esav's return in its fullest glory with his investment through Yaakov Gam Baruch Yeh. Thank you very much for joining. Same time, same place next week. It'd be a good bench Tavach, a good Chodesh, and a good Yom Tov. Be gesund.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good week.
Thank